Hey everyone, I just want to quickly address what transpired last week and why this episode was only up for about 7 hours. See, the game I'm covering, there's two main characters that you play as you're going through, Dave and Linda. And there's a particular point in the story where Dave says, "Not bad for a girl," straight to Linda's face and then tries to dismiss it as a joke. I then proceeded to provide a rage-filled response to this particular story point, which apparently a lot of people weren't okay with, seeing as the downvotes for this video were way higher than normal. So the first thing I want to say is that I don't need to be ragey to express my opinion here. I just thought raging against blatantly sexist comments in the game's story would be entertaining, and clearly it wasn't. As I'm sure you're all aware, I script these videos. Even something like an overreaction is completely scripted. And that's what led to my decision to pull the video. I just want to entertain people, and if what I'm doing is not entertaining and even offensive to people, then I don't want something like that polluting my channel for eternity. So, for those of you who were offended by my overreaction in that video, I apologize for that. However, this doesn't change my opinion that you should generally treat people with respect until they give you a reason not to. Something I didn't point out when I originally did this video is that Linda does not take Dave's joke well at all. In fact, by this point in the story, they've maybe been in each other's presence for a grand total of about 5 minutes. So Dave doesn't know Linda well enough to know that he can make a joke like that without insulting her. So, intentional or not, he does end up insulting her. And when someone screws up like that, what they need to do is they need to take responsibility for their actions and apologize. And Dave doesn't. So that's part of the reason why I don't like him as a main character that I have to play as I'm going through this game. And the other thing too is that I originally used the word misogynistic to describe Dave, which might have come across as a little harsh as compared to using words like sexist or chauvinistic for that particular joke. The thing is though that Dave says some other pretty disrespectful stuff to Linda. The very first thing Dave ever says to Linda in this game is, "Who are you supposed to be?" That's not exactly a good way to make friends. The other thing which came up in the comments has to do with how I mentioned that writers shouldn't be making their main characters misogynists, and I kind of did a bad job of explaining why. See, if you're a writer writing a story, you can write it however you damn well please. But if you're intending your story to be part of a commercial product, then you absolutely have to consider the business side of things. And that means making your main character as appealing as possible. Having a main character, the person that the viewer or this reader is supposed to invest their time in and identify with, if they're not that appealing and behave in sexist ways, then you're limiting your target market. And by extension, you're limiting your potential sales. That's not me trying to tell writers how to do their job. It's business 101. And that's actually why you see in so many different games and stories and movies that the main characters tend to be the most appealing. Not always, but most of the time. Anywho, I hope that clears everything up. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. Oh boy. Okay, so lately, a small handful of people have been telling me that these episodes of Ancient DOS Games have been getting a little too negative compared to older episodes. Well, I'm not trying to be negative, but I understand I can sometimes come across that way when all I'm doing is being technical, or explaining differences without stating whether those differences are a good or a bad thing, since sometimes they're neither. So, for today's Ancient DOS game, Pickle Wars, I'm going to give this thing the benefit of the doubt, because I absolutely hated this game back when it was brand new. And now that I'm older and have much stronger game design sensibilities compared to almost 2 decades ago, I can take a calm, subjective look at this thing and... Oh, hang on. Am I stuck? Seriously? I just started playing this thing. It's the first level, and I'm already stuck. Well, that just set the tone for how awful this game is. I mean, really, this is technically the third game using this engine made by these developers, the first being Word Rescue, which was an excellent game, and it still is. Math Rescue had major issues, both as a game and as a piece of edutainment, but I can at least understand why some people still enjoyed it. But this thing is just plain terrible. And I mean, when you first look at this thing and try playing it, you're probably going to think, yeah, it can't be that bad. I mean, the graphics are okay, the music's okay, the controls are responsive. How could it possibly be all that bad? Well, before we go on, I feel the need to point out one little pertinent detail which may explain some of what I'm about to go into. This game's quality assurance staff consisted of a grand total of 2 people. And just one person for the third episode. Pickle Wars was developed by Redwood Games, the creators of Word Rescue and Math Rescue, but instead of being published through Apogee, this game was published through MVP Software in 1994, which, keep in mind, means this game came out the same year as Jazz Jackrabbit on PC, Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo, and Sonic the Hedgehog 3 on the Genesis. It's a one-player platformer with support for VGA 320x200 256 color graphics and an insane number of audio devices. I mean, seriously, the Big Mouth one is actually an adapter for playing back digitized sound through a telephone. I should also mention that no matter what audio devices you select, some of the sound effects only come out of the PC speaker, and will do so no matter which audio devices you choose, so be prepared for that. As for its current release date, it's technically still shareware and still available from the Redwood Games website at www.redwoodgames.com, where you can download the first episode for free or purchase the full registered game for $12. Now, I should quickly point out that there's a bit of a delay when you do the direct order, as it took several hours following payment before I got my download link for the registered game. As for physical copies, I know there was a CD release of the registered version of the game, as I've seen photos of it, but I couldn't find any available for purchase, so it's clearly rare and I have no idea how much it should go for if you manage to find a copy. That said, given the quality of the game we're about to see, you may want to think twice about spending money on this all the same. So, to that end, you actually do have an option for obtaining a freeware copy of the registered version. If you head on over to the now defunct MVP Software website at www.mvpsoft.com, you'll discover that MVP Software actually released many of their registered titles as freeware. Though because the company is now out of business, they offer zero support for getting these downloads working. And some of them, such as Pickle Wars, look to use an old 16-bit Windows setup program for installing, so getting this particular copy running might be a little tricky. You want to know the irony of all this, though? Well, I mean, besides the fact I spent $12 on this? Well, guess how I found out about the MVP Software website? Through a link on the Redwood Games website. Go figure. I was originally planning to just skim over the story to this game since it's pretty basic, but I actually have quite a bit more to say on it than I thought I did. So let's do a proper story section, especially since the story is one of the few things the game does which doesn't completely suck, just a little. The story begins in orbit over planet Arcadia, a world which has enjoyed total peace for over 500 years, but that peace is shattered when a mysterious alien race arrives and begins their conquest. Arcadia, having no weapons due to the centuries of peace, rapidly starts losing ground to these pickle-shaped life forms. One particular person, Dave, a student of history, is convinced that there must still be some working ancient weapons which could be used to fight off these aliens, so he begins a quest to try and discover these weapons. Along the way, he meets up with a second playable character, Linda, who kinda looks like she's dead inside. Seriously, when they show these two side by side, the difference in the quality of the artwork is jarring to say the least. The first episode primarily focuses on these two searching for the ancient weapons. The second episode is about Linda trying to escape from the pickle aliens while Dave tries to rescue her. The third and final episode is about stopping one of the ancient weapons, a device known as the Doomsday Machine, from being used on their planet. So, the basic gameplay of Pickle Wars is incredibly simple. Move and jump with the arrow keys and shoot vegetables at enemies using a salad shooter. Yes, one of those salad shooters. Redwood Games even got permission to use the trademark. In fact, the goal of each level is to collect all of the salad shooters and make it to the exit. This is kinda odd, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. I mean, I get that some games are basically giant collectathons, so that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the game is basically requiring you to collect all of the ammo in each level to be allowed to proceed to the next. I don't know, it's just weird. Actually, some levels in each game require you to collect more than just the salad shooters. Some levels in Episode 1, for instance, also require you to collect ancient weapons, while some levels in Episode 3 also require you to collect fuel. Even though when you grab the last item you need and it's not a salad shooter, it congratulates you only for finding all of the salad shooters. If it seems like I'm nitpicking, it's because there's so many things to point out that I need to sort of go through these minor things really quickly to not make this video take forever. Now, there's a somewhat interesting mechanic in these games called mail machines. The idea is that each level has a bunch of these floating around, and sometimes when you're near one, it'll spit out a piece of mail which you can then collect and read to get some tips. If you shoot a mail machine with veggies, you'll destroy it and thus not be able to read any of the mail it was going to spit out. Kind of a neat idea in theory, except only the first few pages actually have any relevance to the gameplay, and from then on, it's just flavor text, which doesn't advance the story or really build on the lore of the game in any way, short of just reinforcing particular story points you'd already be aware of. Now, just like with the word rescue and math rescue games, a lot of the levels are filled with warps you can take to get to various other parts of the levels, plus there's switches you need to press to turn moving platforms on and off. You toggle these things with the enter key, and I have to say, the hit detection on these is terrible. You have to be in the exact spot necessary to trigger them, otherwise you can't. And figuring out this exact spot is tricky considering the game isn't actually positioning the player where the game's calculating the player to be. You can investigate this yourself simply by jumping straight up, since if you look right while jumping straight up, you land fine. But if you're looking left when you jump straight up, you seem to land a lot further left than you would expect to, even though you're still in the same horizontal position as when you jumped. The worst part about this is that the devs actually knew this was a problem, and instead of, fixing the problem, they instead wrote a little detail in the help documentation saying, if you have trouble, to hold the enter key down while walking past these things. This kinda works, but kinda doesn't, since you have to be holding it long enough for the standard BIOS key repeat to engage before it helps. And even then, it'll still miss every so often. Plus, it doesn't help with switches because you end up toggling them repeatedly, and can actually break them in rather interesting ways, apparently. The player positioning thing can also get you killed with the moving platforms, as something very strange is going on with how the platform collision detection is being handled. Oftentimes you fall right through them without intending to, and if you're standing on the edge of one when it stops moving, you'll immediately fall off. And we're not quite at the level of ridiculous collision issues as Wizard of Oz on the SNES, but again, let's remember that this is using pretty much the same game engine as Word Rescue, just with updated visuals. And yet, here we are with problems like this. Actually, the platforms in this game highlight two major issues with the level design. The first is that many of the early levels are just filled with these things. And this gets better later on, thankfully, but the early stages are just a nightmare of having to jump between dozens of these platforms. And if you miss, you're either dead or going all the way back around. The second major issue with the level design, though, which persists for pretty much the entire run through this thing, is that these moving platforms take forever to get anywhere. And again, if you fall off or miss because of the collision, you're waiting for the entire length of its motion to get back on, sitting around, doing nothing. Just so you guys can get a taste of how long this can take, here's a real-time example. And yeah, half of the levels in this game have long freaking platforms like this one.
Well, speaking of waiting around, enemies in this game can respawn, which I guess kinda makes sense. The in-game lore tells you that the vegetables simply make the aliens faint, thus if you stick around with a particular fainted alien on screen long enough, it'll return to life. However, this doesn't explain why downed robots can restore themselves too. Also, you may have trouble dealing with the purple aliens which can pop out of the ground, or the green tentacle things which pop out of the background, as you can't shoot them until they pop out, but they only pop out when they can hit you and do so instantly. The trick is to simply shoot while moving and just follow your salad shot at point blank range. The salad shot will hit the enemy as it pops out before they have a chance to hit you. Just be careful shooting long-range salad shots, because if they fly off screen even for just an instant, they disappear. Actually, there is one more thing about the level design which bugs me, and that's that it's just plain boring. Many of the levels pretty much play out exactly the same, with no new mechanics added at any points in the progression. Save for sometimes having to collect other things besides salad shooters, but that's not exactly a creative mechanic. Like, even the graphics and music repeat a lot. Though episode 2 and 3 do add some new graphics if you get far enough in them, but those new graphics don't show up from the start, making you think that those episodes are just reusing the same graphics again with a new coat of palette-altered paint. Again, even Word Rescue knew to put some of the new graphics right at the beginning. In fact, I'm gonna bet Apogee was the one telling Redwood Games to do that. But yeah, you spend a lot of time in these levels just collecting salad shooters and waiting for platforms. After only the first few levels, my brain just sort of went on autopilot, and I was really only just half paying attention for the rest of it. I was so bored by the end of the first episode, I couldn't even bring myself to complete episodes 2 and 3, and I even started hacking my save files just to get a few extra pieces of footage, because I did not want to play prior sections over again, and I found hacking the save files more interesting than playing the game. Lastly, I just want to go over some other weird bugs and oversights. Some of you may recall that in Word Rescue, the ladders could potentially act rather oddly. Here in Pickle Wars, we still have ladder weirdness, just different kinds of ladder weirdness. Also, you can do this on the staircases. And to finish things off, perhaps the oddest issue of the game is that you can't start a new game once you're already playing. I mean, there's not many reasons why you'd want to, but still, the ability to start a new game disappears once a game is in progress, and there's no option to end the current game. I should point out too that the save feature only saves your state from the start of the level, so even if you're halfway through a level and save, restoring the game will put you right back at the start of the level. Now, this can actually be useful if you get yourself stuck, as clearly the level designs weren't play tested enough to spot every little place that you can... Okay, I'm stuck again? In the first level of episode 2, no less. But this time they realized you could get stuck here because they put a little lava pool off to the side so you can kill yourself instead of, you know, making it so you can't get stuck. Beautiful. I don't know what happened, but for some reason, the quality of what Redwood Games was doing actually got worse with each product they put out, rather than getting better. Word Rescue was a great game. Not perfect by any means, but playable and fun despite some of its shortcomings. Math Rescue was an absolute mess, and Pickle Wars is an utter disaster. There's very little in the way of redeeming qualities with this title, and given the fact that it doesn't have an educational component to fall back upon, this means it was in direct competition with far better platformers released the same year or even years before. It's no wonder few people remember this title anymore, and it's also one of the few games where, even as a kid, I knew there were major issues with it. This is not a game I would recommend to anyone, save for the morbidly curious. Although actually, there's one saving grace. Some of the later music tracks in the second and third episodes are kind of fun, which we can attribute to the fact that Bobby Prince worked on the music. It's actually kind of strange that they chose the worst and most mundane of the tunes he made for this to kick off each episode. But then even when Bobby Prince is at his worst, which is extremely uncommon, his work's still passable and only gets better from there. So at least there's that. Although the game does run with the auto or max cycle settings, the auto setting will cause the screen transitions to take a few seconds, while the max setting will cause hiccups in the audio. So I recommend setting a fixed cycles count of around 20,000 to get decent transition speeds, as well as minimal load times and zero skipping with the audio. The game does have joystick support, but I highly recommend against using it due to having to press up to jump. If you want to use a joystick or controller, I recommend using the DOSBox key mapper to remap the joystick commands to keyboard keys. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next Saturday for episode 212, we're going to take a look at a sequel to a game that I already covered a while back, where almost every problem that the player faced would have multiple solutions. And if you think you know which game that would be, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com, and be sure to stay tuned to see this game in action.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.